Welcome to the A to Z Jobs podcast, where we explore the untold stories behind the careers that shape our world, from entry level to executive and everything in between. I'm your host, Nate, and today's conversation is a masterclass in turning unexpected opportunities into a global career. Our guest, Greg, has lived a professional life most of us only see in movies, from washing dishes and working in warehouses to leading HR at Disney and Hasbro. Along the way, he's learnt the power of cultural agility, the art of belonging, and why the jobs that no one wants are often the ones that propel you forward. He's also the author of a book, Bond, Inclusion and the Keys to Belonging, a book born from his mission to make our workplaces more human and more effective. In this episode, we'll unpack Greg's journey, the mentors who changed his trajectory, and why courage, not just competence, defines the best leaders. Let's dive in. Greg, thank you for joining us on A to Z Jobs.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see you.
So let's start off. Give us a bit of a background. What's your career and what inspired you?
Well, I've been very fortunate to have lots of great coaches and mentors over my career. And I think that that's one thing I would leave everyone with as we start, is to build those connections earlier in your career. And I started like, most people start doing summer jobs and parking cars and washing dishes and bussing tables and working in a warehouse for many summers. And actually, when I reflect back on it, those jobs were very formative for me because I sort of understood hard work and I understood what the work that a lot of people later on in my career I would be supporting through my job as a leader and in HR. So I left university. I started to work in a call center, which again was a brutal place to work, but actually a great place to learn. There's nothing like, every time the phone rings, somebody's on the other end complaining about something to refine your communication and resilience skills. I did that and worked for GE for about 8 years in sales and marketing, and then ended up in Florida and started to work for Disney. And my career at Disney was remarkable because I started in operations and then I ended up most of the time there in HR. But when I was in Disney, I was always open to taking the jobs I think that other people weren't so interested in taking. And that gave me the opportunity to work in Florida, California, Paris the first time, which is where I live now again, Hong Kong and Shanghai, and of course, Hong Kong, where you and I met. So, and from Disney, I went to work at Hasbro, which is a toy company, and also worked from Hong Kong in that role in a senior HR job responsible for HR, human resources for Asia Pacific. And then I ended up working in LVMH, also in an HR Asia Pacific job, and ultimately as the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion, which brought me back to Paris, which was a kind of full circle way of ending my corporate career. And during the end of my corporate career in LVMH, I started writing a book, which is called Bond, Inclusion and the Keys to Belonging and Connection. And that is what has sort of propelled me into this next chapter of my career and my life.
That's fantastic. So inspiration. The title of your books, I guess, gives away your passion. So was that your reason for being in HR for so long? Was it that scope you were working through?
Yeah, and I think even as a senior leader in an organization, it's very much an inspiration of mine, which is how to get the best out of people while they're at work. And I think I always recognized in the U.S. that people worked very hard, they played very hard, and there was very little separation between the two. When I moved to France, people work hard, but they also play hard, but there's a huge separation between the two. So people don't mix both of those things. And I think that's very cultural. And then, of course, in Asia, people work very hard and play very hard, but it's also a different iteration of that. But as people are working hard, you also want them to feel comfortable and safe and actualized at work. And as my career grew, first in non-HR roles, but then in HR roles, I saw how important that was. Because when somebody brings their whole self to work and they can be themselves at work, we know that, science and data tells us that those people can be more productive. So ultimately, it's a business challenge to create an inclusive environment at work, because that's how businesses get the best out of people. And ultimately, we all want to go home, and whether we have a spouse or a cat or a dog or kids, we want to be good human beings when we're outside of work. And oftentimes work has a very strong reflection on that part of our lives too. So I think there's somehow an obligation for us, those of us who are employing people, to also be thinking about that. Is, what's the state of the individual that we actually send home each night and that comes in the morning. And again, people that work in inclusive environments and feel like they belong in that environment are better at both of those phases of pieces of life, the home life and the work life.
How do you, like, the thing that fascinates me is sort of the cultural agility, being able to, particularly for those managers working across multiple regions and countries, how do you do that successfully? How is there training, or did you have to seek out your own understanding of how, the play hard, work hard culture is sort of universal, but in a different format? So how do you understand that?
I was very fortunate that my parents were very curious travelers. So my mother, even when she was a young woman, she picked up and taught elementary school in Saudi Arabia, of all places. Now, this was in the late 1950s. So, as a woman of her age, single, living in a place like that, then she traveled around. And we always heard these stories about that. And I think for my sister and I, we became very curious about that life. And then, as we got older, my parents would take us traveling, and they embedded this curiosity in both of us. And both of us ended up studying abroad during university and then working outside the US. And I think part of the key that I learned over time, and I learned it the hard way, I would say, when I first moved, even outside of my home location where I grew up in Philadelphia, when I moved to the south of the US, it's a very different culture, even in the same country. And, being curious and listening is really a key to being successful in those different environments. Because, if I use the example of Disney sends me from California to France for some reason, because I have some knowledge, I have some experience, and there's a gap that they need to fill. But I know nothing about working in France. And so what I learned very quickly was I needed to be the guest, and I needed to be the learner, and I needed to be the curious, versus being the imposer and the smart one and the person that knew everything. And I think that's oftentimes how you see people being successful in multicultural contexts, is they listen, they're very curious, and they listen with genuine intent. And of course, at some point you have to share or impose what you were brought there to do. But if you listen, then you really understand the insight of people who live there, and then it can, you become one of them, and they kind of help you along. And that served me very well when I went to Hong Kong and then into mainland China. Again, to have this kind of open-minded curiosity, and also to be a bit resilient, because when you're in those contexts, you just don't know what's coming next. And, the reality is we're always trying to find like peace and calm at work. At some point you want things, gosh, I just wish things would calm down, or I just wish things would go normally tomorrow. I mean, the reality is companies pay people to do a job to be very much problem solvers. And so you can only be a problem solver if you really know what the problem is. And so by being curious and asking questions and allowing people to challenge you in the way that works in that culture is the way that people can be, multiculturally competent. And you're an example of that. You move from one country, you go to another country, you have different jobs in different companies, and it takes time. And, we talk about culture in aggregate. So European culture or French culture, American culture, Australian culture, Hong Kong culture. Well, companies have cultures too. And even within companies, the culture of Disney in the US versus France versus Hong Kong versus Shanghai, we're all very different. And then within a company, you have its own, subculture. So culture it can be a bit frightening, overwhelming, but it's also fascinating when you start to understand how you can leverage all these different unique components to build a successful team or successful company, or ultimately successful career.
And you mentioned, so at the start, you mentioned you left college and went to the call center. Did you finish college and then went to the call center, or college wasn't for you and you decided a different path?
I'm not sure college was for me or for not, but I did finish.
Good. Yeah.
I had a good time in
Yeah.
school. I was not a great student. And I finished university and I went to work in the call center at GE. And I recognized that I wasn't done learning. So I was learning at work, but I also had a curiosity about learning more academically. So I started to take some classes on the side that were related to my job, not anything sort of sort of program. And then ultimately, I went back and I got a master's of business administration because I felt like, okay, there's more room in my brain for some knowledge, and I think somehow in the future this is going to help. I surprised myself by being better at that intake of education than I had been academically at the first part, and I think it's because I had the reference of work. I could you could talk about things, and there was something to refer it back to. And I think when I was in undergraduate, it was the class was something you had to do between hanging out with friends and doing sports and doing other things that were within the university context, but weren't necessarily about graduating. And then ultimately, when I got to Disney, I was promoted into an HR job. I did not have any HR experience at all, but this goes back to the power of mentors and coaches. When I was at GE, my boss said to me one time, he said, "You might consider being in HR. I think you could be pretty good in HR." And I had like no idea what he was talking about. I was I had kind of had in my mind, like, maybe I'm just so bad at sales, like he thinks anywhere but sales would be good for you. And I think that was part of it, frankly. But part of it was he saw something in me that he believed would be a successful profile in HR. And when I got to Disney, I was working in an operations job, and my manager at the time said, "Would you ever consider being in HR?" And now he had spent time in HR, so I knew he knew what he was talking about, and he was a pretty senior person in the company. And I said, "No, I hadn't, but if you think it's something that I should pursue," I trusted him, and he eventually promoted me into this job of being the HR manager at Epcot. Epcot's one of the theme parks in Florida. Now, Epcot has like 7,000 employees. It's like a big HR job. And I very quickly realized I was just very ill-equipped to do the job well. I could do parts of the job well because I had good relationships with people, which is very key in HR. But there were a lot of things that I just technically didn't know. So I had sworn to myself when I graduated with my MBA, I was done with that. And here I was 6 months later walking across the parking lot the other direction to start a master's in HR program. And that was very helpful for me too, because it gave me, if nothing else, it gave me confidence and credibility that I was in the right place. It also reinforced as I went through the program that actually I knew more than I had given myself credit for. And ultimately, it was an extremely good foundation for me to pursue the HR career that I had over time.
So now about the book. So tell me more about this book. How long has this book journey been? What has that involved?
So the book is a COVID baby. I started the book, I think even when I was sort of towards the end of my time at Hasbro, I started thinking about this. This is maybe like 2018, 2019. And then I got more serious about it when we were in lockdown, because as you recall, in Hong Kong, we had some pretty heavy duty lockdowns. So there wasn't much else you could do. And so I started working on the book and doing the interviews for the book. And I also, in my work life, because when I went into LVMH, I was working in Moët Hennessy, which is the wines and spirits part of the company. They had asked me if I would, in addition to being the head of HR for Asia Pacific, if I would help them kick off diversity and inclusion for the company globally, which I had a lot of passion for, and I had some experience. So I was like, okay, fine. What else am I going to do? I've got plenty of time around here. And so I started that project, which ultimately became my job several years later. But what I saw with the work that we were doing is that, and we were trying very much in the kickoff of doing it in Moët Hennessy, was to make diversity and inclusion an expansive and an inclusive effort, so that we didn't start with, as an example, we didn't start at the underrepresented group. We started at the culture. So how do we build a culture that understands its unconscious bias? How do we build a culture that leverages the values of the organization to be more inclusive, a greater sense of belonging? And what I saw in the world of diversity and inclusion was that was a bit of an exception. There was a lot of focus on the underrepresented, the misrepresented, and there was a lot of focus, I think, on the tension that was being created. And people were starting to check out of the conversation because, I say something that's incorrect, and rather than trying to help me be better, I'm scolded for what I said. And so when people get into that environment, they walk away from something. After a couple of times, you're maybe willing to play the game, but eventually it's like, oh, I don't really need this anymore. I'll focus my area somewhere else. And so I wrote the book with the intention to make inclusion more inclusive, which was to tell the stories that I had from my career, with things that I had done right and many things that I had done wrong, and try to invite people into this discussion about why inclusion and belonging is so important to businesses. And so that, it was kind of a blessing. Well, it was a blessing for many ways that COVID ended, because I think if it hadn't ended, I probably would have never finished the book. So I started to have some deadlines and finished the book, and it's been an amazing journey for me since the publishing of the book.
How hard is it to write a book? Was it hard? Do you have to wake yourself up like a day job and sit there for hours writing, or what was your approach to doing this book?
So I had in my mind, one of the reasons I never wrote the book never had started any book, was I always had in my mind that I wanted to be a travel writer. And my husband, not at the time, he's my husband now, but my husband was at the time the owner of a business that actually published a magazine. And one of the things they did in the magazine was they would do travel articles to very high-end places. And his editor was on vacation and they needed to do an article. So he and I wrote this article about this place in Fiji. It was amazing. And after the process was over, I was like, I actually like traveling more than writing about traveling. And part of the thing was I always had this sort of very Ernest Hemingway mindset of the way people would write a book, which is you would sit down in the morning for 4 hours and, once upon a time in a land far, far away, the princess did this, which wasn't at all the process. The process was more, I would say, like a term paper, which was you collect some things, you put them together, you collect some things, you put them together, you write it up, then you go back to it. The first time the whole transcript of the book was together, it was a mess. And so I read through it. I was like, okay, this doesn't work. There's nothing here. And then it's like you have to refine it and play with some things, add some things, take some things away. So it's not a linear, at least for me, it was not a linear process. It was a very iterative process. And I was given advice by somebody that was very helpful, which was to not over edit what I wrote also, because the more times you read it, the more times you think, oh, I should clean that up. I should change that. I should add that. And then eventually you make it, you're back to a white piece of paper, because that's the only thing that's pure enough that you're willing to move forward with. So ultimately that was the process. And now I'm actually embarking on writing a second book. And I have to say, the first book, if I have one tip of writing a book, it's talk to people who wrote books earlier in your process, because book writers and authors are generally. So if I had one lesson for people writing books, I would say talk to people that have written books. And I did that relatively late in the process. I don't know why it just came to me like, oh my gosh, I have a number of friends who've written books. And that was very helpful to me because it grounded me. It helped me get through the process. It relieved some of my kind of end of book writing anxiety. And now, as I embark on a second book, I'm much more confident about the process and the ups and downs I know that are coming, and I'm actually enjoying it much more because I'm less anxious about where it's going. Especially as I interview people for the book, which are just that this is one of the great blessings of my post corporate career has been the doors that have opened and the doors that the book has opened.
Are we allowed to know the title, well, the working title or the subject, or it's all under wraps for now?
Still, imagine it's a soup, but all the vegetables are still sitting on the cutting board.
That's a good analogy. I like it. I'm in the process of writing my own book. I've been dabbling with it just because I've been working with so many diverse clients, and it's back to the cultural agility piece. It's so common. The things that people, it doesn't matter if you're from Taiwan or if you're from Edinburgh, everyone has the same challenges when they're moving country, and they have the same challenges and the same fears. So I might hit you up for a second podcast more about book writing, and we can talk more about book structure.
Yeah, happy to. And I think the work to do on helping people be culturally literate or culturally competent, especially as they go through high stress times in their lives, is really noble work. And I had done, that was part of one of the things that inspired me to get into this, was when I joined the Shanghai Disneyland project. We had developed a program called Doing Business in China. And the program was to ultimately create a company culture, because we were starting from scratch, except that we had China and Disney. So it's not really scratch, but the company is like new. And so how do you bring the best of those two things together and create a culture in which, everyone can sort of thrive and survive, and the project can be successful, referencing a lot of Disney projects that struggled when they first started, especially the ones that started outside the US. And so that really opened my mind to this kind of jewel that is cross-cultural competency. And in that project, when we did that program, it wasn't just foreigners coming into China that went into the program. It was everybody that started there, whether they were from mainland China or not, sat in a one-day program together, and we ran it every week. And that created a culture. It created a language. It created a way of working. And ultimately, I think, was a foundation of the success of that project.
That would have been a fascinating time. The HR part of me just loves the idea of being able to get in there and do a culture from the ground up like that. It would be amazing. I'm very jealous and envious.
And it's a lesson from what I was saying earlier, is that's the kind of work that oftentimes people don't want to do, because it's a bit scary maybe, or it's in China, and that China, I don't understand what that's going to look like. It seems far away. How am I going to get the food I want? All these things go through people's heads. And for people who are especially in an HR space, if you want to accelerate your career, you do it through things like that. You go into areas that maybe other people don't want to take on, that may be a little bit risky, but they have higher reward. Ultimately, even if you go into some environment like that and it doesn't work out, you still have that experience, and you can leverage that experience for something that's the next play for you. So I really encourage people to not be afraid of what seems risky, because likely it's an experience that will benefit you in the long term.
I suppose we're talking a lot about the positives in your career. Is there any negatives? Is there something that stands out as you've struggled with, or that you wish you had done differently?
There's one episode in my career that I wish I could play back. I don't have too much sort of anxiety about the past, but when I first got to Hong Kong, I had a manager, and we just didn't get along. Now, fortunately, we only worked together for 11 months, because I think if there had been a 12th, I probably would have left. And when I reflect back on that, in my sort of more mature self, what I wish I had done better sooner was kind of call out what it was, to say, this isn't working. We have a disconnect. How can we work this out? But what I was trying to do was kind of, in a way, protect myself for what was coming, whether that was, to be pushed out or to move to some other job, which eventually is something that happened. And that is I would say, maybe the one regret I have in my long career is to not have addressed that early on, because it ended up being 11 very difficult months in an environment where the work was not easy anyway. So we were trying to build the park in Hong Kong. The beginning of it was very tough. And it ended up also affecting my personal life to one point where I remember one conversation with my husband, and we were talking about something, and he said, "You might talk to people like that at work, but don't talk to me like that at home." And so that was like a wake up call for me. Like, okay, this pressure is not sustainable. Now, I never really properly dealt with it because that woman that I was working with moved on very quickly. She didn't stay very long. And so that's something I wish, in any work relationship, I think it's important that, especially when things are starting to go the wrong way, that we have the courage to call it out. And it could be that, had I called it out earlier, maybe I would have ended up moving somewhere else to some other company, which also would have been another path and another career, and I'm sure would have worked out. But that's, I think, something that's important.
That courage, though, is very hard to draw upon. It can be very difficult, yeah.
Especially when you're more junior. I mean, the level between me and this person was huge, and but that's also part of the role of HR people, is you have to be able to have those difficult conversations. It's always easier in HR to advise other people of what they should do rather than what you should do, I think, which was also the lesson I wish I had given myself at that time, which is, you're helping other people through these difficult times. You need to give yourself a little bit of that advice as well.
So if someone's listening and they want to fast track, they decided, yes, HR sounds fantastic, particularly the diversity and inclusion space or workplace culture. What advice would you give them in terms of fast tracking that career for them?
Well, I think, my winding path of getting some solid educational experience was important. But also I go very, very far back to the jobs I was doing. So like doing the jobs that people are doing that you eventually in HR are helping people to do better is important. So, I reflect on, even at Disney, I spent a day in a character costume in the summer heat in Florida as Tigger. And so until you do it, you don't understand what the job's like. We would spend holidays filling Cokes, cleaning up trash. And it wasn't in my job description, but it was part of how you appreciated what people do. And I think for HR people, it's very important to appreciate the job that people are doing as part of your own understanding of how you can support them, how you support the business, and also how you are credible. So people see you out doing stuff, that helps. So in terms of fast tracking to, say, HR or diversity and inclusion, it's important that you have credibility, that you've done the work, so that you can say, okay, well, I've done that job. I've worked in the warehouse. I've driven a delivery van. I've done these things, which ultimately helped me to be credible. And because I had those experiences, when I interviewed for jobs, it made me much more interesting in the interview, because I didn't have this kind of clinical path towards something. I was collecting experiences and interactions and relationships that were very critical to my success. And I think there's a second thing, that it can never start soon enough. It's like saving money. Start building your network as early as you can and nurturing the network. So building a network is one thing, like, okay, you and I connect because we knew each other way back when, and now we're doing a podcast. So that's great. But during the interim, you have to water it. Otherwise it doesn't survive. And so I encourage people to take network building as seriously as anything in your career, because at some point you will want to rely on the network and you will want to take the vegetable from the garden. But if you don't plant the seeds now, then when you need the food, it's not going to be there. And so it's important that network is a key to people. And some people are very good at it, and some people aren't. And I would say to people that would say, I'm not good at it, then you just have to make it something you're better at, because it's indispensable for you in your career.
I believe people overthink it. I was reading somewhere, one of the easiest ways to do the sort of the watering of the network is just open your LinkedIn messages or your contact list, scroll to the bottom. Who haven't you spoken to for the last 6 months? Send them a quick message, just say, thinking of you, how's it going? Yeah, any updates? And it can be that casual just to touch base with someone.
And that's absolutely the case. People often get intimidated by, Nate's really busy. I'm sure he has a lot to do. I don't want to bother him. I can tell you that I'm pretty busy. I have a lot to do. And when somebody sends me a message out of nowhere, it's like, whoa, great, let's connect. So it's not a sign of like you gave me something else to do when you asked to connect with me. It's that you recognize that there's some interest that we have together. And so don't deprive others of that kind of interaction and recognition by thinking, they don't want to talk to me. If they don't want to talk to you, they won't talk to you. So electronic communication is easy enough. It can be ignored. And so if you want to reach out to somebody and you think there's something interesting for you to share, or even just to say hello, do it. It will pay off.
Just last weekend, it was Dragon Boat Festival, and I got a message from an old colleague that I did Dragon Boat a few times back at Hasbro, and I got a message from an old Dragon Boat colleague going, I'm actually living in your hometown now in Adelaide, and I thought of Dragon Boat and thought of you, just saying hi. And it's such a nice, I love it. I think it's a nice connection.
Yeah. And you don't know, like maybe next time you go to Adelaide, you'll catch up with that person, and
absolutely.
And you'll say, oh, we actually have more in common than we thought, and maybe it's a personal connection or a work connection. You just never know. I have found that this stage of my career, so in this sort of more independent world that I'm living in, that a lot of those connections from my past are now coming back in different ways, in different iterations, and I'm really enjoying that.
So, resources, any books or podcasts or anything that you've used that you keep returning back to, or anything that stands out as a resource that you would recommend people to check out?
I've started to do a lot of reading to try to be less dependent on social media. And I'll tell you my method. So my method has been to first read about subjects that are at this point in time relevant to me. So right now it's relevant to me to understand France and French culture and French language, because I have to survive and bloom where I'm planted, so to speak. But the other thing is I think is important, and especially for people that are in human resources, is to reach out beyond your barrier. And so what I do now is every 2 weeks I buy 2 books. One book is about here, now, France, language, culture. And the other book is something that's totally outside of my normal day-to-day. So it could be a book on leadership about a topic that I don't know anything about. Like I just bought a book called Millennial Thinking. It could be I just finished a book on Irish short stories. I mean, so they really like try to be very far afield in terms of my mind, because one of the things that I believe what's happening to a lot of us is that through social media, we're becoming, I wouldn't say dumber, but more narrow. We're probably becoming deeper in what we see, but more narrow in what we see. And I think for people who are developing your career, again, you want to develop yourself as an interesting person who knows things. And so in addition to learning about the craft of HR, which is important, learn about other things, because they will ultimately, there's some relevance to all of those things back to our work. So those resources to me are not necessarily specific, but it's a way that I'm trying to continue to educate myself and expand my mind beyond what's right in front of me.
Yeah, and even if you're short on time and don't have time to read a book, even just searching a different YouTube channel or a different audio book will do the same thing.
Exactly. I mean, Spotify is amazing. The audiobooks that I listen to, whether I'm at the gym or walking around town or making eggs in the morning, whatever it is, you really can learn a lot. And the thing is, everything's a bit disposable. So if I get into something, it's like I cannot do it anymore. I can stop. So use resources like that, but I think very much try to listen and be curious about things. Back to the origins of my story, is be curious about things that maybe you wouldn't naturally be curious about, because in those things you're going to learn about how to learn. You're going to stimulate something in your mind to learn more. And I think that those things are really important for people who are coming into the working world or building careers, or coming out of careers and coming into the next chapter.
Another thing I try to do as well is because I tend to drift towards nonfiction. So every couple of weeks I try to pick up a fiction book just to stimulate different parts of the brain and get thinking a bit differently. So I think any avenue just to mix it up is a healthy habit.
I think opening your mind to things that are different. It's back to the beauty of the world of diverse and inclusive teams, is that if you are somebody who has exercised your mind to be open to difference, then the way you come into work, the way you work with other people, is going to be more sophisticated than somebody who has always sort of narrowly focused on one topic in one area. You might be an expert in that. And, even in HR, I spent like almost 30 years in HR. So I was pretty good at it. I think I knew a lot about it. But even that, things change so rapidly that I had to constantly be a learner as well. So I'm not just I'm not accumulating all this knowledge. I accumulated a lot of experience. I'm not sure how much the knowledge over time was evergreen. It had to be refreshed. I had to continue to build my own understanding, and that by going out and learning things that are totally outside of my normal day to day was also a way to keep exercising my mind that way.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. As we wrap up, any quotes, any mantras, or anything you sort of rely on for a little pick me up or just a reminder in life?
Yes. So I have learned something. This was like in the last couple of years from a good friend of mine who I went to university with. And her father, who's I think in his 90s, mid 90s now, he has this phrase, and he says to them all the time, and he says, it's later than you think. Now he's 95, so take the point. But we had a long conversation about that over breakfast, and I really took that to heart. And why that means a lot to me is my mother passed away a couple years ago. She was 93, so she lived a great life, but I remember her when she was my age. And so I start to think, okay, not that I'm rushing to do a million things, but I'm trying to spend my life in ways that I think are meaningful, that have meaning to me. That can be like sitting and reading a book all day. It doesn't have to be that I'm going to run for president of France, or I'm going to go to the moon, or I'm going to be the first person on a Mars Elon Musk rocket. But that you do things with intention, and that things have meaning, because it's later than you think, and you don't want to look back and think, oh gosh, that was a kind of a year lost. And so I look at what you're doing, and it's very impressive, because you're helping other people with so it's something here, something there, and you don't have to impact a million people. You impact one person meaningfully, and that's like you can do that once in a lifetime, and that can be a lifetime. And so to do that over and over, I think is really impressive. And to do it in a meaningful way is what I try to do with my life.
That's beautiful. What a lovely way to wrap it up. Thank you, Greg. It's been great having you. I'll make sure we put links to your books and everything in the profile description so everyone can check it out.
Thanks for inviting me, and it's nice to be back in Hong Kong for a few minutes.
Thank you. If you'd like more information about this podcast or our other guests, please check out coachingbynate.com for more resources and learn how coaching and mentoring can help develop your career.